everybody here in person and here online. We are Mel.
I'm Hayley.
And
Kevin.
And we're part of Liberate, Tate, an art collective based in London who have spent the past 6 years campaigning for an end to BP sponsorship of Tate galleries. And this year, we won. From 2017, Tate will no longer accept BP sponsorship. And 6 years ago, this is something that was not thought possible. So if you take nothing else from our talk today, take the idea that art can make real change happen. So Liberate Tate started around the time of the Deepwater Horizon disaster beginning, when we saw that BP was just surviving the onslaught of criticism that it faced over here because it had the support of British politicians, media, and arts figures. The whole oil industry survives on what platform, also based in London, call the carbon web. So the branches of supporting infrastructure that daily maintain oil companies' profitability. And art sponsorship is seen by the PR industry as a key tool to build what they call a social license to operate, a kind of guise of social acceptability that hides the true harm that they're causing around the world. Liberate Tate wanted to free the gallery from the harmful presence of the oil sponsor, and we wanted to deny BP this social license that they so desperately need to survive as a company.
And so we spent 6 years making site-specific performance work in the Tate galleries. And to do this, we really had to kind of reevaluate everything that we knew before. And we found during this process that we were making a form of non-binary art activism. And this is a kind of form that doesn't privilege art or activism, but fuses both. And we made this carbon web in response to platforms. We made this cultural web in response to platforms' carbon web. And it really helped us to position ourselves in relation to other groups and artists and activists and writers and collectives in relation to the subject areas of oil, protest, institutional critique, and education. And we've kind of got ourselves in the middle there.
So we wanted to talk today about 3 of our performances in relation to the theme of occupying power. And for us, we've interrogated the idea of power in our work, not just in terms of political and cultural hegemony, but about power as energy itself, what comes out our plug sockets, what goes in our car, what powers our day-to-day lives. Now, we all know that there's an urgent need for a justice-based transition to a low-carbon economy and society. Unfortunately, oil companies are using their enormous political and financial power to try and stop that transition from taking place or slow it down as much as possible. So in 2013, we did a performance that was called The Gift, which involved us smuggling a 16-meter wind turbine blade into the iconic Tate turbine hall. And the turbine hall is itself the site of an old power station where coal and oil was burnt to generate power. Now, the blade was split into 3 different parts, and over 100 people carried those 3 different parts into the turbine hall where it was assembled. And this was a very contested occupation. There was a certain amount of struggle and pushing with the museum staff in order to get it inside the gallery. This was very much a prefigurative articulation of the clean energy future we want to see. This is kind of trying to occupy the future amidst the architecture of an old and outdated power system in the turbine hall. And this is an old, outdated, dangerous power system that Tate is helping to perpetuate through its association with BP. Now, we didn't just submit the turbine blade, we also submitted the necessary paperwork under the 1992 Museums and Galleries Act in order for the gift to be formally considered as a gift to the nation and be taken in as part of Tate's collection. So this meant there was a further occupation of Tate's power structures because the board of trustees, which was chaired by the ex-CEO of BP, John Brown, had to formally make a decision on whether or not to accept the gift. And despite our eagerness to be co-opted by the Tate, they refused the gift, but they did accept the documentation that went alongside it.
In 2015, we made Timepiece to draw attention to the fact that Tate was deciding whether to renew its sponsorship deal with BP. We were running out of time, and we needed to ramp up our challenge to the Tate. So we occupied the Tate Modern Turbine Hall for 25 hours. And we used tidal time rather than gallery time to measure our stay. And we stayed from high tide to high tide the next day, in accord with the Thames tidal river, which runs adjacent to the Tate. So 100 of us sneaked in with a library of books and sustenance in our bags, and we built a camp. And we started writing in charcoal a tide of text up the floor of the Tate Modern Turbine Hall. And visitors that were at the Tate could lose themselves inside the insides of books that were written on the floor. During this process, Tate called the police, but we refused to leave, and we stayed fast. Tate then closed off access to toilets and bathrooms, and we made our final reveal. We had a compost toilet that we built in the space. So we held the space with very practical things, with food, with water, with beds. And we brought in other voices, ideas, and discourses. We had fiction and non-fiction. We had books about climate change, capitalism, art, activism, and the Anthropocene. And we demarcated the space with text. Online, we trended on Twitter as people tweeted their favorite authors and retweeted their favorite phrases. And we occupied the language of participatory art and brought our arguments into the museum.
On the first day of the Paris climate talks last year, we wanted to address BP's role in causing climate change as the third biggest emitter of carbon. And so we made Birthmark. In the side, the BP-sponsored Walk Through British Art at Tate Britain, and we made it in the 1840s gallery because that's when the Industrial Revolution that saw the rise in carbon emissions began. In this performance, performers receive a permanent tattoo of the parts per million in the Earth's atmosphere in the year of their birth, followed by a less than sign, indicating increase and a kind of question mark, what happens from here. So for example, my birthmark is 343, Kev's is 329, and we were both born before 350, within the safe level, and now we live when we've reached past 400 parts per million, which climate scientists call a tipping point. This piece explored permanent change, healing, and ritual, and we learned to give tattoos ourselves on our own bodies. We smuggled this mobile tattoo studio into the gallery, including a large battery inside a suitcase so that Tate couldn't easily switch us off. And the relationship between the tattoo givers and receivers mirrored that of the painter and the sitter, and the sponsor branding the body of the gallery. This year, we made the performance again at the BP-sponsored Portrait Award, where previously Imperial Tobacco sponsored it. And this kind of fact itself demonstrates that things that once seemed inevitable can change.
Since we started, this has become really a much bigger conversation than just about BP and Tate. It's a much wider discussion going on all over the world about art, oil, climate change, sponsorship, money, and institutional critique. There's a whole bunch of different groups have popped up using similar methodologies or looking at similar targets. In the UK, there's the Art Not Oil network, including groups like BP or Not BP, who are targeting British Museum, their association with BP. In Norway, there's Statoil, sponsors a lot of the cultural sector. Groups are pushing back against that. Just in the last month, a group in Netherlands has been taking on Shell's sponsorship of the Van Gogh Museum. Here in the United States, the Natural History Museum are doing amazing work, targeting the relationship of the climate denialists, Koch brothers, and their various institutional relationships. So there's one initiative that cuts across all those different groups called Fossil Funds Free, or fossilfundsfree.org, where groups, individuals, institutions pledge not to take money from fossil fuel companies or to raise questions with institutions that do. So we're going to formally invite Creative Time, who aren't receiving money from fossil fuel companies, to formally articulate that pledge into the future. But I'd also like to invite everyone to consider whether their practices or institutions they're involved in might be somehow involved in enabling oil companies to trash communities on the planet, and whether they'd like to become part of a movement around the world where we're fighting for a world of art and not oil. Thank you.
Thank you. Should we make way?
That's for you, Nathan.
Thank you for this. I'm taking this back to committee. That'd be funny if Katie, if I was just like, we agree, and you're like, what? No, but we don't take oil money. But listen, I got a question for you. So, congratulations on your victory. This is a very misleading panel because everybody's got a victory. And clearly, Occupy Power is a universe of losses. So, just to put in perspective, don't get too excited. But what about, like, from activist communities? Do people say to you, oh, you're going after British Petroleum, but it's much more complex than that. All funding is difficult, complex money. What about hedge funds? What about banks? You get what I'm saying? Like, how do you respond to that? Because, of course, also, I know from institutions, they'll say, what, do you want us to not be funded? This is the landscape. You get what I'm saying?
Yep.
So how do you respond to that?
So I think everyone needs to make their own decisions according to where they're at in their discussions. From our point of view, people ask us that. And for instance, Tate now has a sponsor, it's Uniqlo, which is a clothing company with really appalling labor conditions in China. And so say, why aren't you going after Uniqlo, for example? For me, Uniqlo, as a company, has an opportunity to resolve those labor conditions, whereas BP is a company that has a business model that's structurally dependent on trashing the planet. All that BP can do is drag us over the edge of climate crisis. And so I think there's a kind of fundamental difference on top of the enormously shrinking timescale we have to make the changes to limit the worst impacts of climate change.
And it's also about the fact that we're going after BP. Yeah. We're an art collective and we want to protect the kind of spaces that we're a part of. But we want BP to end in existence in terms of what it's doing. And that really came in response to the Deepwater Horizon disaster. Sure. So taking that away from BP is a way to take away their power.
And what being in the Tate galleries did was it gave us an opportunity to platform those arguments against that company.
I completely love what you're doing. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.